Hi everyone, welcome back to the History Buff, and welcome back to the History Buff's series on the Berlin Wall. So this is episode 2. So the History Buff series on the Berlin Wall is where we chart the history of the infamous barrier that divided a city in the heart of a divided Europe. So in the last episode, I explained to you the events leading up to the Berlin Wall, which included the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War. But in this episode, I am joined by a fellow Berlin tour guide and fellow history buff, Quincy. Thank you so much for joining me, Quincy. Do you want to maybe just introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I am a Berliner on paper in that I was born here in Berlin, but I grew up in Australia. I moved away when I was about 18 months old and spent basically my whole childhood in Australia. Mm-hmm. Where I did my bachelor's.
In what?
A Bachelor of Arts in Politics and History.
Right, okay.
Yes.
Cool, okay, so you're a trained historian, basically, unlike me.
In theory, yeah. I was then kind of caught up in the stream that everyone takes in Australia to go and do law, if you do an arts degree.
Okay.
And was very close to doing a law degree before I got cold feet and thought, hang on a minute, I don't actually think I want to be a lawyer. I need to at least take a bit of a break before I commit to something like that.
And so that brought you back to Berlin.
And that brought me back to Berlin.
Right.
Thinking I'd spend a gap year here.
Okay.
And here I am still 6 years later.
Okay, cool.
And I ended up actually studying here because it's basically free compared to extortionate in Australia.
Same in the UK.
Yeah. So yeah, I did my master's in history here too. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of when I got my start tour guiding, first at the Berlin Wall Memorial, but since then all over the city, really. Amazing.
Cool. Okay, well, lovely to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to join me.
Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. It's an absolute pleasure. And I'm really excited to get into this series, being joined by other tour guides to get their perspectives and their knowledge. Because that's the thing about being tour guides, is that we all like know the same stuff, but we have like our own ways of approaching it, our own like bits of knowledge about different things. So I'm really excited about exploring this topic. So yeah, welcome. So the end of the war saw the division of Germany and Berlin into 4 sectors between the Western Allies, the US, Britain and France, and the Soviet Union. The mass movement of people over to the west eventually caused the building of the Iron Curtain on the inner German border and all the way down the border between Eastern and Western Europe, 7,000 kilometer border. Even after this, though, there was still a hole in the Iron Curtain, which was West Berlin, because West Berlin, it was like this island of Western land in East Germany, so in this kind of like sea of communism. And it was a hole through which East Germans could flee to the west, even after the Iron Curtain had actually already come down. And by 1961, between 500 and 1,000 East Germans were fleeing every single day through West Berlin. Okay, so the total number of East Germans having fled is thought to have been just under 3 million. Although actually there's different numbers that I see for this.
I've always said
2.8.
Yeah.
2.8 to 3.5. Mm-hmm. So I've heard 2.8 and then also 3.5. I always say about 3 million because it's sort of, I guess, in between there. It's around that ballpark, let's say. So yeah, in the millions. Millions of East Germans had fled. And most of these people were young, educated people who'd been educated at the GDR's expense, at East Germany's expense, who are now taking their very valuable skills to the West. So yeah, it was a brain drain. So it was a big problem. And so this is obviously then what leads us to that fateful night on the 13th of August, 1961. But I guess before we get into that, let us talk about the sort of final events leading up to that fateful night.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess really the two main actors we have in this sort of part of the story have got to be the leaders of the Soviet Union and East Germany.
So Khrushchev and Ulbricht.
So, yeah, Nikita Khrushchev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union, and Walter Ulbricht, the leader of the GDR. So basically what happens, I suppose you could say, is the leader Ulbricht, he was quite plucky. He was the leader of this small satellite state. Well, okay, actually, to be fair, it was actually the satellite state of the Soviet Union that had the highest living standards, and it definitely punched above its weight in terms of the other countries in the Eastern Bloc. But still, he's meant to be really subservient in the sort of Soviet communist chain of command. But he was pretty plucky. I guess that's because he knew that it was such a bad problem, and that if they didn't do anything, it was gonna lead to the collapse of East Germany. So he pressures Khrushchev, essentially saying to him, "If you don't, let me build a wall, we're going to collapse." And he basically says to Khrushchev, "Yeah, if you don't let me build a wall around West Berlin, East Germany is going to collapse, and that is then going to make communism look really bad. So if we fall, you fall." Essentially, I think that's what he's trying to say to him.
More or less, yeah. I think what's also interesting in having read, for example, some of the conversations between them is the way that they always use this very roundabout language.
Right.
And they always use their own sort of talking points, I suppose, in order to sort of present all of this information. And the way that Ulbricht is almost presenting the idea of the Berlin Wall to Khrushchev is similar to the way that he then tries to present it to the broader East German population.
Well, as an anti-fascist protection barrier.
As an anti-fascist protection barrier. Yeah. And he says it's a measure that's being necessitated by the West, who are smuggling people out of East Germany, is I think the term that he uses, people smuggling.
Yes.
And that it's this this threat that's being placed
so
on
he
East
frames
Germany
it as an
by the
ideological
West.
struggle, basically.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes.
And it's, well, from the sources that we have available to us, it's not just in the propaganda that they use that kind of language. It's within their own internal discussions that they're using this kind of very padded language that kind of presents it in a certain way.
Yeah, and the thing is, so he's pressuring him to let him build a wall. And the reason why Khrushchev is dragging his feet is because he's afraid of how the West is going to react. But also, Ulbricht wants Khrushchev to also sign a separate peace treaty with the GDR.
Right, yeah.
Now, people wonder what this means.
I think ultimately it's about recognition and kind of formalizing the borders of Germany and also, as they are at that point.
And signing over the rights to control the skies, I think, crucially, to the GDR, who I think then would take a lot more of a sort of tougher stance on allowing
travel out of West Berlin.
Yes, specifically flights, because that's how most East German refugees went to West Germany, is from flying, because obviously if you were to go on the train or on in a car down the motorway, you would most likely get stopped by a border official. They'd see that you're an East German and then probably make up some convenient excuse for you to have to stay in the East.
It's a riskier way to get out.
So then most East German refugees were flown across to the West. So the idea behind this is Khrushchev, he wants to get control of the skies, and so he wants to stop flights from being able to leave West Berlin to go to West Germany. Basically, it's actually also to annul the four power status of Berlin. He says that he wants it to be a free city.
Right.
Yeah. So it'll actually be neutral. West Berlin will be neutral. But obviously, I think
right in the middle of
exactly. So I think people know in reality that is not what is going to happen.
I think for West Germany, they still see the whole situation around Berlin, but I guess as Germany as a whole, as a state of exception, as a kind of temporary situation that's still a kind of hangover from the end of the war, and that the borders haven't been finalized yet, and that the systems haven't been finalized yet, and by getting an official peace treaty that recognizes those borders and recognizes the power of the East German government, that's meant to make that sort of more permanent and final rather than being this kind of reunification. And West Germany always pushes for an eventual unification of the two halves as this sort of thing that's approaching in the future.
Yeah, and I think also the GDR, East Germany, it always, I think, maybe felt a little bit of an inferiority complex because they weren't actually recognized as a state by most Western countries until 1973.
Right.
And I think this actually, made a lot of the leadership in the GDR feel not sort of altogether accepted, I guess, in the international community.
Sure.
So I guess signing a separate peace treaty with Khrushchev was Ulbricht's way to kind of do away with having to get the West's,
permission.
Yeah, and the West's sort of approval. Yeah. So this kind of fairly diminutive man, about 5'7", was about 170,
something like that.
170, and with a very high voice from a childhood, I think, infection. He is getting this kind of big bear from Ukraine to kind of agree to his demands. And it's fair to say that, he was pretty plucky, pretty insistent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they do actually start planning the Berlin Wall without the green light. And so Ulbricht actually starts planning the so-called Operation Rose with his security, with the Politburo, which is the highest decision-making body in the Communist Party, the security secretary, a young Erich Honecker, who is obviously a future leader of the GDR, but at that point he was pretty young. He had actually been, before that, the leader of the Jung Pionieren.
The FDJ.
The FDJ.
The youth organization.
The youth wing of the
GDR.
GDR
SED,
Communist,
rather.
The SED, so
Communist
the
Party.
GDR Communist Party. And then he'd become security secretary, and he meticulously plans, obviously, the building of the wall, codenamed Operation Rose. And so, Honecker, in doing this, he obviously assumes responsibility for the operation. Now, on the 15th of June, and by the way, I actually couldn't find exactly when they started planning it, but it definitely was. But
my research said April 61.
At April, right, okay.
It was when he set up the team to begin preparations for a potential closure of the border.
Right. Okay. So obviously, well before the actual date, they had actually been planning it, and also even before they got a green light from Moscow. So on the 15th of June, Ulbricht gives a famous press conference, which I mentioned in the last episode, where he was actually asked by a journalist if he was going to close the border, to which he responded with I guess you could say, quite an infamous line now.
Absolutely.
Which is where he said, Niemand hat die Absicht, eine Mauer zu errichten, which means no one has any intention of building a wall. And I think that was quite a clever ploy on his part, because no one mentioned a wall. They just said a border or something.
Closure.
Yeah, border closure.
Something
so
like
no
that,
one said a wall,
but
he's now said it. And so I think him putting it out into the world was meant to have a specific effect.
And kind of almost bring it into the debate in a way that makes it happen.
Yes. Well,
or makes it more likely to happen.
Yes. Well, and I think that's exactly what I think was meant to happen, because as soon as people then heard of this wall, it caused an uptick in the number of people, number of East German refugees crossing into West Berlin.
Yeah.
And I think this was deliberately, I think actually Ulbricht meant this to happen because I think he wanted to increase the pressure on Khrushchev.
Oh, okay, interesting.
I think, it was probably a ploy to push Khrushchev into giving him permission to building the wall, and this obviously then came in early August.
I found an interesting interview with Ulbricht's old interpreter.
Did he not speak Russian?
No, Ulbricht did not speak Russian. He had an interpreter whose name was Werner Eberlein, and he obviously sat in on conversations between Khrushchev and Ulbricht. And years later, I suppose he participated in a documentary and gave interviews about the 3-day conference of the Warsaw Pact countries that takes place on the 3rd to the 5th of August 1961.
Right.
Which
I think that's when they get he gets the final. I think there was like layers of green lights.
There were layers of green lights, but this is the one that the SED Politburo actually presents as having been the situation where the green light was given. There's no record of Khrushchev signing something, yes, Ulbricht, you may build a wall.
I think that was on purpose, though.
Probably. But there is record of Ulbricht's handwritten notes from a conversation between, presumably, him and Khrushchev, where they discussed administrative measures, closing the border. And so Eberlein, the interpreter, years later gives a kind of interview about this, and he sort of makes this point that the idea of controlling the border was what they were talking about, and that there were discussions about, finding ways to make it easier to check the papers of everyone that was going across and reducing the number of border crossing points, but they didn't actually speak in so much detail about exactly what a border closure would look like.
Right.
And he almost
keeping
presents
it deliberately ambiguous.
He almost presents it as though it didn't even cross their minds that they would need to build a wall, which doesn't really fit in the timeline. This is 5th of August. It was already in June.
But I think the only people who knew about the wall were the upper echelons of the Politburo.
Sure, but he's basically... Eberlein is basically saying that when Ulbricht says no one has any intention to build a wall, he's not lying, because at that stage they hadn't even thought it through that far.
Oh, okay, right.
Right? And that they wanted to control the border in Berlin vaguely.
But they didn't realise what shape that would take.
And didn't have a specific plan.
Right.
For me, that doesn't quite fit, because I think there's records...
No.
A, you already have Ulbricht himself talking about a wall at that press conference, but B, a few days earlier, Khrushchev and Ulbricht had a phone call.
You know what it was?
Discussing this, and terms like wall are used in that phone call.
Right.
So it's one of those kind of moments where you wonder who kind of what kind of presentation of that process is being made.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, there's also a story that actually when the Soviet ambassador to the GDR received a green light from Khrushchev, said that he was giving his permission. I think this is one of the layers of green lights. It was multiple, I think, green lights over a couple of days in early August. The Soviet ambassador went to find Ulbricht, who was apparently in a session of the People's Chamber, which was the parliament of the GDR, and told him that Khrushchev had given his permission to build the wall. And apparently Ulbricht immediately revealed all the plans in great detail. And so actually there's the ambassador was like quite taken aback at how much detail that there was. And so I think that shows how much they had been planning it.
Right. Yeah.
So anyway, the point is, gets his green light.
On the 7th of August, there's a special sitting of the Politburo, and that's when they decide on the night from the 12th to the 13th as the date, or at least that's when they officially agree it.
Right.
And they also call the Volkskammer, the parliament, to sit for the 11th to give its approval for the plans, because even though the Politburo has basically
supreme power,
a lot of things still need to be rubber stamped by the parliament, right?
Yeah, because of the constitution.
And so they basically call the Volkskammer to sit on the 11th, and then there's a sitting on the 11th where the minister president of the Volkskammer announces the new measures against people smugglers, and talks about the measures that are going to be taken. And it's all very vague, but it sounds like some kind of border closure that's going to happen. And on the 12th, there's an uptick in people arriving at Marienfelde.
Okay, right. Yeah, Marienfelde, by the way, being the transit camp for East German refugees in West Berlin.
Yes, so you see people who presumably watched that sitting and saw that as an indicator that there's going to be increased challenges in getting over. And so that even that step that obviously has to happen to some degree in public, because it's the parliament, they set it for the 11th, so sort of as close on the last Friday before.
And they obviously picked Sunday because they knew obviously people would probably be, Sunday morning, because they knew
it's going to be the quietest.
Exactly.
Yeah. And also in the sitting on the 7th, that's when the official invitation to the event that we're about to talk about is made.
So basically a garden party in the GDR government guest house in Dönse, about 80 kilometers north of Berlin. Ulbricht was up there readying everything for the garden party on the 12th of August. And whilst he's getting everything ready, Erich Honecker drives up to see him. And he basically drove up to see him to get the sort of final kind of the final orders for Operation Rhodes signed off by Ulbricht in his capacity as the chairman of the National Council of Defense. So he just got that signature. He just needed that signature. And then he returned to East Berlin to the police headquarters where he would then direct the operations. Ulbricht stayed in Guernsey, where he was then going to host the Council of Ministers. So normally in a, democratic state, the Council of Ministers is the body that would really hold supreme executive power. But under the SED constitution, the SED, the Communist Party, their right to rule was actually enshrined in the first article of the constitution. So it was actually the job of the Politburo to make policy. And then it was just the job of the Council of Ministers to enact that policy. So they actually didn't really have any real kind of power in terms of policy making. Their job was just to implement the decisions of the Communist Party, essentially.
Right.
So the Council of Ministers come to Guernsey, and I think it's obviously quite a nice setting, because it is actually, I've seen pictures of it, and I would actually quite like to go, because apparently I think it's now a hotel.
Right.
And the Council of Ministers arrive. There's lots of food that isn't usually available to people in the GDR. Lots of champagne. But the thing is, I think the ministers find it a bit awkward. They're kind of like, why are we here?
What are we doing here?
Yeah.
What is the purpose of this meeting? Why are we getting all this special treatment?
Yes, exactly.
What does Ulbricht want?
Yeah,
surely?
exactly. They can smell something afoot, and also I think that what makes them slightly maybe also a bit nervous is that they can see in the trees surrounding the guest house tanks. So like army tanks and like soldiers are like in the forest surrounding them, and I think Ulbricht,
very coup vibes.
Yes, exactly. And Ulbricht says to them, "Oh, it's just for your security." So, yeah, basically, the Council of Ministers all get a little bit tipsy, and Ulbricht, who is very kind of sober, he then calls a meeting.
I love the way this is written in Honecker's biography by a guy called Norbert Pötzl. Obviously writes out these events, and I don't know where he has the exact wording from, but he says that at about 10 p.m. Ulbricht takes them into a little side room, and he says, "Wir machen jetzt eine kleine Sitzung." Yeah. As in, we're just going to have a quick meeting.
Yeah, now. Exactly. And so by 10 p.m., and remember, it was a garden party during the day, so most of them probably been drinking since mid-afternoon at least.
And it's August, so the height of summer, they're probably absolutely
exactly
by that stage.
So yeah, it was chosen a very specific time, and so they're pulled into this room, the Council of Ministers, and officially it was to obviously get their backing for the for the building of the wall. Okay. And Ulbricht says to the ministers, so we are about to seal the border between East Germany and West Berlin, and we just need your signatures. So basically, I think he tried to portray it as not a very big deal.
Yeah. Here's the plan. Here's how we're going to close the border.
And you're going to sign it off.
Everyone agrees, right?
Yes, exactly. Everyone. Yeah. He says, everyone in agreement. Yes. And I think, to be honest, that was meant to be a rhetorical question.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Because it's impossible to say no.
Exactly. So the ministers obviously. So basically, yes, it was a sham vote. Because the power, as I said, didn't really lie with the Council of Ministers in the GDR.
But he was still
but
constitutionally,
he still needed their signature.
He wanted to make sure he was on sort of stable ground, I suppose. Yeah.
So constitutionally still needed their signatures. So, needed their rubber stamp, essentially.
Yeah.
And also, to have them all there in Guernsey, it was also for strategic purposes. It was also to make
far away from the events, to make sure that none of them could cause any trouble. So having them all in this sort of fenced off by all of these tanks and soldiers in the forest was actually a way to make sure they couldn't go and cause any trouble, obviously in Berlin. So then 3 hours later, it happens. It begins.
So at 1 a.m., Operation Rose came into action. So at this time, you have between about 15 and 20,000 police, army, and border personnel started to block off all roads into and out of West Berlin. And they then immediately started tearing up the ground and putting in concrete posts, which they obviously attached barbed wire to. Now, in the days preceding this, tons and tons, miles and miles and miles of barbed wire had been brought into Berlin, and this did actually arouse suspicion. A lot of East Germans had seen it.
As well as the troops that were being brought in as well.
Yes.
Obviously, all of the...
From all over East
border
Germany.
guards, but also members of, I think, 2 entire divisions of the
Volksarmee,
were brought in... Yeah, from all over East Germany, and they specifically chose people from outside of Berlin, so that they didn't
have any skin in the game.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, in total, obviously 150 enough barbed wire for 155 kilometers of the border. So that's obviously a lot of barbed wire, but they are very speedy, and this again just goes to show how meticulously it was planned. The border is secured by 6 a.m., just 5 hours later. So by 6 a.m. on the morning of the 13th of August, the entire 155 kilometer border is secure. Yeah. If you're an East German, you can now no longer go into West Berlin. If you're a West Berliner, you can now no longer go into East Berlin. And if you have stayed overnight in one of the sides, then you are stuck.
Tough luck.
Tough luck. So, I mean, in reality, if you're a West Berliner, you will be able to eventually get over to some kind of diplomatic mission and then be able to get over. If you're an East German, you need to make your decision whether you're going to stay in the West or if you're going to go, because also they would want you to come back, but it's now the choice is now in your hands, so to speak.
I think what's interesting about the exact kind of first closures, there's records of the West Berlin police and the way they responded to this. And the man who was on duty is a guy called Hermann Beck, the Oberkommissar on the night shift at the West Berlin police headquarters. And the very first message that he receives is at 1:54 in the morning from Spandau, that an S-Bahn train was turned around. It was heading it was heading from the Soviet sector into West Berlin, and it was sent back. And it specifically noted that all of the passengers had to disembark and were given their money for their tickets back.
Oh, really? Well, that's just one of the logistical nightmares to come from the closing of the border, because, the S and the U-Bahn,
run through the border.
Well, and also about 60% of the S-Bahn was in the West, and about 80% of the U-Bahn was in the West. So it created a whole logistical nightmare. And so, but obviously these trains would then be blocked from going off into the West if they were coming from the East, and then vice versa. Yeah, and obviously East Germans who worked in the West were cut off from their jobs. The first reaction from the Western Allies is one of obviously displeasure. They register the displeasure. They say, they have to build a wall to keep their people in. But there's, in reality, not a whole lot they can do.
Very little they can do. And I think they're also
actually quite relieved, I think, because it solves the Berlin crisis.
I guess so. And also the kind of initial worry is that this is an attack. And that's the question that that Hermann Beck, the police officer, has to deal with. Does he raise the alarm level? Is this something that's going to turn into a bigger attack by either the Soviet Union or the GDR on West Berlin? Are they trying to invade or something like that? Or are they just closing the border? And he gets more and more reports that, yes, there's troops, yes, there's border closures, yes, there's lots of border guards being posted all along the border, but they're all keeping to the centimetre on their side.
Yes, and actually even more than that. The wall was always built at least 5 to 10 metres back from the actual border. They were the Germans were very careful not to encroach on any Western land, because they didn't want to give the Western Allies any sort of excuse to be able to call them up.
And the orders that the military have on that night are very specific about exactly how they are supposed to support, because there's basically border guards and police doing the work at the border itself overnight. And then about 1,000 meters back is where the actual army troops are stationed, and they're kind of the backup.
Yeah.
And they have very specific orders to keep all of their munitions in separate boxes, not to load until they have specific orders, and the actual use of their weapons is categorically forbidden.
Yes.
Without the permission of Hoffmann, who's the defense minister.
Right.
And so there's very specific measures that are taken to make sure that they don't
alarm
them too much.
Yeah, exactly. And there's not a whole lot they can do because they're sticking to their side.
Mm-hmm.
The mayor of West Berlin, future West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, he is very angry that the Western allies don't do anything. So much so that he actually pens a rather impertinent letter.
Good word.
To US President John F. Kennedy, where he basically says, what the hell are you doing? Mm-hmm. Why are you just letting the Soviets build this wall? So I don't know, just to kind of imagine this. You receive a letter, you are the US president, and you receive a letter from this, very impertinent letter from the mayor of, a tiny city, because remember it's just West Berlin, so a city of 2 million people. Although I guess, to be honest, you've got to kind of put yourself in Willy Brandt's shoes, is that, West Berlin is very symbolic. So I think he probably thought that he had a lot more influence than he had.
Sure. And it's the kind of arena of the Cold War. It's where all of these tensions are at their closest.
Exactly.
At their most acute.
So to be honest, actually, forget what I just said. West Berlin very much had a very special status.
But it's still quite a
it's quite a bold move
in terms of like the etiquette and the kind of rank for a mayor to,
and JFK was
pissed. JFK like that.
JFK was really angry. He was like, what the hell does this mayor think he's doing? And because Willy Brandt signed off the letter, your friend Willy Brandt, or your Willy Brandt, or whatever. JFK was really angry, although didn't really matter because a couple of days later he did actually send his vice president to West Berlin to kind of show solidarity. So at the end of the day, it didn't really matter, but it was still pretty bold on Willy Brandt's behalf. And also I think it's because it was in the middle of a general election campaign. It was in the middle of the 1961 election campaign. No, what am I talking about?
Yes, no, that's right. Between Willy Brandt and Konrad Adenauer. Yeah.
Yes, and
Willy Brandt was on a train somewhere in West Germany, to Kiel. There you go. On the campaign trail,
and he went back to West Berlin.
And he had to.
No, he decided
woken up and flew back. To West Berlin to be there the next morning.
And I think JFK cynically, but maybe a little bit maybe he was right, thought that he was doing all of this stuff, writing him a letter to kind of play to a gallery.
Right. Yeah.
Which, it's politics. This kind of stuff happens.
Yeah, fair enough.
But anyway,
I think the other funny thing is that JFK happens to be on his yacht,
right,
the night that the Berlin Wall is built.
Uh-huh.
And there's this great story about when the information first arrives in Washington. There's the official in the State Department that's on duty overnight because it's midnight local time. His name hilariously is John Ausland. Ausland means foreign in German. Works at the State Department, naturally. And he receives a telegram from the CIA in Berlin to inform the president.
Right.
And he goes to the State Department to find the folder for the situation if the border were to be closed.
Right.
The kind of file. And he finds it to be empty.
Oh, God.
And there are no plans
whatsoever
in the State Department. So the only thing you can do is just tell JFK, who supposedly is at first a bit annoyed to only be finding out 5 hours later.
Yes.
At 5:30 in the morning. But he kind of calms down about that and prepares a statement with Dean Rusk, who's the Secretary of State.
Exactly.
And that's kind of it.
That is kind of it. That's all they can really do. Yeah. And the thing is, JFK reflects on it. He says, wall is better than a war.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it was unfortunate for those poor East Germans who wanted to leave, who are now trapped in East Germany, but it basically did solve the tension over Berlin between the Western Allies and the Soviets.
Yeah, I guess so.
So ultimately, I think JFK, he obviously felt very bad, but he was like, this is actually really, to be honest, probably the only real solution. Then they obviously and obviously the sealing of the border is very, very successful, and it definitely secures the way that it is done so efficiently and so competently definitely secures Honecker's place as the front runner to replace Ulbricht. He gets a lot of political capital for this, and Ulbricht then spends the next decade kind of preparing Honecker to take over from him. So yeah, it was a very, very well executed operation. Doesn't end there though. They then immediately after the barbed wire has been put up, start building the first version of the wall. So yeah, I don't think a lot of people know about this version of the wall, because I think
it's always tricky, I find, talking about versions, because it's, I don't know, I've always imagined when you talk about versions, you kind of have this image of like, they did the barbed wire and then they designed a new version and then they built that entirely and then they let that stand for 5 years and then the next one came along, like versions of a phone or something like that, as though they were like generations in this sense. But I think it was
more of a continuous iteration.
Right. It's this kind of ad hoc process of continually developing, and particularly in the early stages, it's more about what does the exact street that we're trying to close look like, and how do we seal off this specific section, what makes the most sense, because the way the border runs through the center of the city really varies quite a lot.
And obviously closing the border and building the wall around the suburbs was pretty easy, but obviously in the center of the city that was actually pretty hard, because you had like lots of obstacles in the way.
My understanding also about the outer border was that it was actually primarily a fence to begin with, and you only really see walls on the inner border between West Berlin and East Berlin, and I think it's only between was only West Berlin and East Germany
in the 1970s, I think.
Yeah, that was kind of fence work for most of it.
So very labor intensive building that first wall. But for argument's sake, let's just say first version of the wall.
Yeah, I mean there is a kind of
the first
where they use these I guess they're like breeze blocks or something like that.
Yes.
These fairly big bricks,
about 1.5 meters high, so that they were built.
So you could easily look over it. And then they have these kind of Y-shaped metal
staples
sticks that are then used
which had barbed wire
hold
on
the
them.
Barbed wire. Exactly.
The concrete blocks 1.5 meters high, and then they had the barbed wire on top, and then and that was built by about 60,000 builders, and it was completed in 2 days. So the whole wall was completed by the 15th of August. So, I mean, they knew that they would have to do it quickly. Otherwise, people would take advantage of the kind of chaos surrounding it. So they knew that they had to get it completed as soon as possible.
There's also, I mean, like I said, there's kind of these points where it varies. Supposedly one of the very last parts of I only found this out the other day, one of the very last parts of that original wall from the first days is actually just next to the East Side Gallery at the very northern end of it, near the Ostbahnhof, where it would then turn left to go across the river again. You wouldn't even know it was the wall, but there's basically a red brick wall to about halfway up, which was an existing wall of a factory or something there. And then there's these bigger blocks on the top, which take it up to actually quite a high height. It's probably about 3 meters high there. And set in the concrete at the top are broken glass bottles, which were like the kind of makeshift version of the barbed wire running across the top.
Well, definitely in the first couple of years, it was definitely more makeshift.
Totally.
And you had that instance also with border houses. So houses where you would have, some of the house open out onto the east. Maybe the front door opens out onto the east.
Generally, streets, if a street was a border between east and west, the official border was generally drawn on maps to run along the house facade, because these are all based on the old suburb borders of Berlin, the divisions between the different districts, and just for kind of, I don't know, surveyors purposes, they would always put the border on the house facade rather than down the middle of the road.
Right.
Not always, but often. And so that meant that you
The building would be in the
often
east.
had a situation where the entire building was in the east,
east.
but the moment you stepped out on the footpath, you're in the west.
So, but then that meant that the people living there were in the east.
Yes.
Were considered in the east.
They were residents of East Berlin, but
Right.
the moment they stepped outside their front door, they were in West Berlin.
Right.
And so they kind of had, at first, a very easy way out just through their front door, and then the initial plans foresaw sealing off those doors, either nailing them shut or bricking them up. But then you have the problem where people start using their windows.
Yes, exactly.
Because these people are still living there, and yes, there are now entrances that lead out to the rear, so they go out through the courtyard into the back of the house. But obviously, you can still jump out the window. And this happens a lot at Bernauer Straße, where the Berlin Wall Memorial is today. You have dozens of families that basically very spontaneously decide they're going to jump out of their window and get over into the west.
And eventually these houses were then evacuated by the East German authorities, hollowed out. Obviously the windows were bricked up. Hollowed out and then actually used as part of the wall. So the idea was, I think, to help obviously keep costs down, obviously when it was still quite sort of makeshift.
They even put barbed wire across the roofs to make sure the whole structure of it. Yeah.
But then eventually in the last version of the wall that we're going to come to, that was all blown up and taken away, and it was just the wall the whole way around. But for now it's still quite a lot of makeshift, different kind of materials and So then the next year, I guess you could say really the second version includes the creation of an inner border wall, so known as the Hinterland. And it was built approximately 100 meters further into East German territory, but it depended where you were. The length of this strip of land actually depended where you were. But
there was an officially prescripted 100 meter exclusion zone, which is kind of the basis for that. So I guess the Politburo decides to create a rule that no one's allowed within 100 meters of the Berlin Wall.
Right.
And they
no, but that's beyond the Hinterland Wall, isn't it?
No one's allowed within 100 meters of the
inner border wall.
Of the border.
Yes.
And they mean that on both sides.
Oh, okay. Although in the West it would definitely was not enforced.
No control over what people did on the western side, but they intended that no one should get within.
Because technically, if you went right up to the wall on the western side, you were in East Germany.
Right, and also in their internal propaganda, the wall was there to protect East Germans against West Germans.
Yes.
So in their sort of way of presenting all of this, it was actually all directed at...
Because, remember they said
Berlin.
This is an anti-fascist protection barrier to keep capitalism and fascism out.
Right.
So, when you had this inner border wall built, houses between the wall and fences were razed to the ground. Inhabitants were relocated, obviously like they had been before with border houses. And this strip of land came into, most people would call it, a lot of people call it no man's land, but I think the more accurate, what it was officially called was the death strip. Now, the death strip was covered with raked sand or gravel to detect footprints and facilitate the detection of trespassers and to monitor guard diligence as well. And it obviously offered no cover and provided clear fields of fire for wall guards. Now, it didn't just stay like that. They actually kept adding things as the years went by. And there was one escape that actually took place in 1963, I believe. And it was where this guy rammed an armored vehicle through the wall. And because of that one escape, they then spent millions of marks putting in anti-vehicle obstacles. So like those railroads welded together.
Yes.
In X's.
Spanish riders, I think they're sometimes called.
Yeah. And so that was the creation of the inner border wall. And I guess the idea behind that was just to make it just that little bit harder to get across.
And also to kind of obscure the border itself a little bit as well,
because also even if you were on the eastern side near the actual inner border wall, if a policeman saw you around there, he would tell you to piss off.
You'd still
because as you say,
you're still in that 100 meter zone, and unless you live,
you had to have an ID, I think.
Yeah, so the people that lived within that zone would have had to carry ID.
Yeah.
And supposedly it was also quite difficult for them to have visitors over, stuff like that. And you just get all this situation where all this rigmarole. Anyone going in or out of that zone needs to prove why they are doing so.
So then, in 1975, they improved the outer border wall, because by then it's pretty rudimentary, really, the first wall.
Yeah.
So they then put proper concrete slabs, and they put, crucially, the tubing on top.
This is kind of where they start using kind of their construction techniques that they use for housing as well. So by the early 70s, they're trying to figure out how to deal with the sort of housing crisis that's contributing to the just general economic challenges in the GDR. And at first, their approach to housing is to just try and repair as much of the stuff that was damaged in the war to make it livable.
Yes, exactly.
But by the 70s, they've kind of exhausted that as a method, so they have to start building Plattenbau. Yeah, so they have this this official program called the Wohnungsbau Programm, which is officially enacted in October 73, but it's planned from basically from 1970, and they say they want to build 3 million houses by 1990. And the only way to do this is with massive serialization and standardization of building, because materials are very scarce, and their access to concrete and also to labor is very low. So building stuff with bricks and so on is not really viable on that scale. So the only way that they can build 3 million new apartments is to basically standardize this and make these really mass-produced pallet builds, as they're called, where they basically just use prefabricated concrete blocks and stack them up very, very, very high. And their goal was 3 million by 1990. They claim to have reached that goal. Supposedly, it was probably closer to 2 million that they actually achieved. But in 1988, Honecker has this sort of...
Honecker, by the way, took over in 1971.
Correct.
From Ulbricht.
Jumping ahead a little bit here, but he had this this ceremony where he handed over the 3 millionth apartment to the family.
Oh, okay, right.
I think since research has put the number at closer to 2 million that they actually built, but I think it was
still better than the German or British governments today.
Right, absolutely. And
in
many
we
ways,
could do with some of those homes.
In many ways, it's one of the biggest successes, I think, because it's one of the most visible traces of the GDR that you can still see in Berlin today. If you spend any time in the eastern part of the city, there are these Plattenbaus absolutely everywhere.
They're not necessarily nice to look at, but people had homes.
Right. And I think...
Although some of them are quite nice to look at. I like some of them.
They have their moments.
Yeah, they do.
But basically, this was this kind of mass-produced building method, and I think they start to apply similar approaches to building the wall as well. And so that's why they use these concrete basically sheets, which are identical to the sort of sheet you would use in the building of a Plattenbau, and they just slide them in between two metal tracks. So there's a metal track put every 3 or 4 meters, and then you slide these sheets in between, and that is used both as the border wall and the hinterland wall. I think sort of throughout the late 60s and early 70s.
So then over the course of the next 10 years, you have various kind of improvements in the sort of death strip. They add, trip wires, searchlights, big
signal fences, which
watch towers. Watch towers, which are every 300 meters. And so it does become pretty, quite comprehensive. And to be honest, by about 1965, people stopped going through the death strip because it was just too hard. It was just too well guarded.
And that's the way they justify all of this. It's a safety measure. By spending all of this money, they are making the border safer for their citizens. So that they don't have to shoot at them as much. Yeah, exactly.
And immediately afterwards, you actually didn't have... It wasn't until, I think, October 1961 that soldiers got the order shoot to kill from Erich Honecker. And he actually got put on trial for that after the GDR collapsed. Didn't get convicted because he had liver cancer, very advanced liver cancer, and he went to die in Chile. A lot of people like to think that there were landmines in Berlin. There were no landmines in Berlin. There were landmines on that inner German border between East and West Germany, but there were no landmines in Berlin. The reason that is because you had a lot of West Berlin flats that were literally on the death strip and could look over the death strip and had views of the death strip. And you can imagine, if a West Berliner is just at home one evening and, is just chilling with, a glass of wine looking over the death strip, his beautiful view of the death strip. And he's looking over the death strip and he sees, an East German, running across the death strip, and he gets blown up by a landmine, and maybe the leg of that poor East German lands on this West Berliner's balcony. That's not very good PR for the GDR, is it? So
Even
there were
for the
no
GDR, that
landmines.
was too uncomfortable.
Yeah, so no landmines in Berlin, but on the inner German border, no. But what you did have was beds of spikes.
What do they call it?
Stalin's carpet.
Stalin's lawn. Stalin's carpet.
Yeah, Stalin's lawn, Stalin's carpet. So then you had the building of, in 1975, I guess you could say the most
Iconic.
well known,
Yeah.
the most iconic,
Yeah.
infamous version, which was known as
Grenzmauer 75.
Grenzmauer 75, so border wall 75. And so this was obviously the final and most sophisticated version. So building started in 1975 and was completed around 1980. And by this version, like we said earlier, everything in the way of the wall was completely destroyed. And by this version, it was the wall the entire way around the whole 155 kilometer border.
Yeah.
Okay, so and that's why a lot of people sort of say, well, why couldn't people just go around the wall? It's like, you need to show them a map. Be like, honey, this is why. Because it went around the whole city.
Island,
yes, it's an island.
All the way around. Yeah.
So, it was built from 45,000 separate sections of reinforced concrete. So each 3.6 meters high, steel reinforced, and about 1.2 meters wide. And the total cost of this version of the wall, this very comprehensive version of the wall, was about 16,155,000 marks. Also, concrete provisions were added to prevent escapees from driving through the barricades. And also, at strategic points, the wall was actually made weaker to allow East German and Soviet armored vehicles to break through in the event of a war.
I didn't know that.
Basically, every kind of version of the wall, they improve it, make it that harder to get across, to get over. And obviously, in this version, built between 1975 and 1980, they put in that smooth piping to line the top of the wall to make it more difficult to scale. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because also what a lot of people don't realize is that the GDR was also planning another wall. So this was Mauer 2000. Yeah, still looking towards the future because obviously they didn't envision that they were going to collapse by the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. And so they did actually make plans for a so-called Mauer 2000, which was going to have various, lasers and high-tech technology to sort of like make it that much harder for people to get across. But obviously these plans never got realized because the GDR collapsed in 1990.
And I wonder how realized they ever were. For me, it feels like it was more of a kind of buzzword that they used. So it was this big presentation that they made for the 40th anniversary of the founding of the GDR, so on the 7th of October 1989. So they were thinking about the kind of border crossing system as well, and it was this super bureaucratic process where people crossing the border would be basically handed off from one bureaucrat to the next, and it was this kind of long chain of bureaucracy as you go through the process of getting your visa and then having it issued, and then
sounds like Germany today.
Yeah, not much has changed, and so in 89 they're talking about making this high tech, and they set up the first sort of tests with computers to go through that process because they were concerned about it being kind of abused and misused. And it was designed to be as difficult as possible and as long-winded as possible.
Sounds also like Germany today.
German
bureaucracy today.
Right. But it also meant it was sort of susceptible to subversion. And so there were these kind of plans that were meant to digitize all of this all the way back in 1989. Still having a conversation about realizing anything like that in Berlin today, of course.
Well, I guess maybe it'll be interesting to finish up by saying how the wall is seen by tourists, and I guess how it's become such a sort of tourist, attraction.
Right.
Because obviously, we as tour guides, it's like obviously a big part of our work because it's I mean, I would say that it's probably, along with the Nazi era, the thing that attracts people most to Berlin. That history, the Berlin Wall, the Cold War, it's really, I think, along with the Nazis, the thing that attracts most people, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the kind of slightly twisted thing about being a tour guide in Berlin. That you really are making your money off this quite dark history and this quite uncomfortable thing. And I think the way that the wall has kind of become such a symbol for the division, but just the Cold War in general, means that obviously it's going to be this attraction in that sense. People want to see the sort of physical version of the Cold War. But it's interesting how I've always found it sort of interesting that the version of the wall that everyone knows only stood for 10 to 15 years, right?
Yeah.
And it was kind of only seen by West Berliners because it was the outer wall.
My mum actually has a fantastic picture, which I will put on the YouTube video, that she got from a platform looking out onto the east.
Right. Yeah. One of the viewing platforms they set up on the west. Right. Okay. Yeah.
When people come to Berlin and want to see the Berlin Wall, a lot of the time they're like, "Oh, can you tell me how to get to the East Side Gallery?" Which is a part of the wall. Mm-hmm. It has been, I think, like kept up since the fall of the wall. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, it's got some interesting murals on it, but it's the world's longest open air art gallery. Yeah, there's not many original parts still left. That's an original part. The part at Checkpoint Charlie
is original,
and
then the memorial,
in Ben Arch, and then there's a few other ones I think as well, but they're not very well known, and I think they're in parts of Berlin that are, I think, quite difficult to get to.
Yeah, on the outer border.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. A few bits that are sitting around on the border, for example, at Potsdamer Platz.
Yes.
Were just put back there.
But if you guys are wandering around Berlin, just keep a lookout, because there are these 2 rows of cobblestones which run throughout the city, and they just run randomly around the city, and they denote where the wall used to stand. So where the outer border wall used to stand. Okay.
And the trick with them is there are also metal plaques that run along there. Yeah. And it just says Berliner Mauer 1961 to 1989. Yeah. And if you can read the text the right way around, you're standing on the western side.
Because obviously, west is better.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. If the text is upside down, you must be in the east.
By the way, I was totally joking about that. I really don't think the west is better. I think both have strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so I was joking. Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us in this episode. Quincy, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
That was a very interesting conversation about the plan of building the wall, the actual building of the wall, and its various iterations. So do join the History Buffs Berlin Wall series next week, when we're going to talk about escape attempts, and the unfortunate deaths at the wall. So I will be joined for that with another fellow tour guide. So do please join me. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and otherwise see you next week. Thank you very much for joining us, guys. Bye.
Thank you.